What happened in Manila 3 weeks ago represents the single most consequential strategic commitment the United States has made in the Indo-Pacific region in the last 40 years, and almost nobody is talking about it. While Western media focused on routine military exercises and diplomatic pleasantries, something far more significant occurred beneath the surface. In districts the United States just walked into a strategic trap that will fundamentally alter the balance of power in Asia. And the people who designed this trap have been preparing it for over 2 decades. I am going to take you inside every dimension of this moment. How did the Philippines transform from America's oldest Asian ally into a potential strategic liability? What does committing 9 new military bases in the Philippines actually mean when we apply game theory and structural analysis? And why might this alliance represent the exact type of imperial overextension that has destroyed every previous hegemon throughout history? There are no comfortable answers tonight, but 3 questions will drive everything that follows. First, what is America actually getting from this alliance when we examine the military geography and technical capabilities involved? Second, what strategic vulnerabilities is America creating by concentrating forces in an archipelago 7,000 miles from California and just 200 miles from mainland China? And third, what do the historical patterns of island fortress strategies tell us about how this arrangement will end? By the time we finish this analysis, you will understand why the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement might be studied in military academies as a textbook example of how empires make catastrophic decisions while believing they are demonstrating strength. Let me start with what actually happened, because the mainstream narrative completely misses the significance. Arstintis I store I ain't this out I see din charge for I see arts, the technical reality of 9 bases in an archipelago. The Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, expanded in 2023, now gives the United States access to 9 military bases across the Philippine archipelago. Not token facilities. Not symbolic presence. So then, that's good. 9 functioning military installations where American forces can pre-position equipment, stage operations, and maintain permanent rotational presence. The official justification is straightforward: containing China, protecting Taiwan, maintaining freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. Here is what that actually means on the ground. The northernmost bases sit in Cagayan Province, just 250 miles from Taiwan. The western bases in Palawan sit directly adjacent to disputed territories in the South China Sea. The southern bases in Mindanao provide staging grounds for operations throughout the region. From a Pentagon perspective, this looks like strategic encirclement, or answer. 9 points of presence creating a defensive arc across the first island chain. Let me give you the numbers that matter. The United States is investing over $300 million in infrastructure upgrades across these facilities. That includes runway extensions capable of handling B-52 bombers, ammunition storage facilities, fuel depots, and barracks for rotating forces. The agreement allows for pre-positioning of equipment, including Patriot missile batteries, artillery systems, and potentially intermediate-range missiles once the INF treaty restrictions no longer apply. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. framed this as mutual defense and economic benefit. The United States framed it as deterrence and alliance solidarity. But here's what the structural analysis actually shows. America just committed substantial military assets to locations that are indefensible in any serious conflict scenario, created tripwire forces that guarantee American involvement in regional disputes, and handed China the clearest possible example of hostile encirclement to justify its own military expansion. Think about the geography for 30 seconds. The Philippines is an archipelago of over 7,000 islands stretching across 1,100 miles. The population is 115 million people spread across complicated terrain with limited infrastructure connecting the islands. The 9 bases sit at distances requiring naval and air transport for resupply. Every single facility is within range of Chinese land-based missiles operating from Hainan Island and the southern coast. Now compare this to what China has built. The People's Liberation Army has constructed a comprehensive anti-access area denial network throughout the region. This includes over 2,000 ballistic and cruise missiles specifically designed to target fixed installations and naval vessels. Advanced air defense systems create overlapping coverage across the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea. Underground facilities protect critical assets from first strikes. And the entire system operates from territory that China controls absolutely. The United States just placed military assets inside the range of this weapons network, in facilities that cannot be meaningfully defended without commitment of forces that America cannot sustain. This is not deterrence. This is creating hostages, but understanding the technical geography is only part of the picture. We need to examine the strategic logic, because this is where the trap becomes visible. Arjinar, Argin trained, Argentiu. The game theory of island bases and strategic tripwires. Let me walk you through what happens in a crisis scenario, because this is where theory meets reality and the entire American strategy collapses. Imagine tomorrow morning, tensions escalate over Taiwan. China initiates a blockade, not an invasion, just comprehensive control of sea and air access to the island. The United States faces a decision: intervene militarily or accept Chinese control. Now add the Philippines bases to this equation. American forces are stationed across 9 facilities in Philippine territory. These are not just equipment depots. These are manned installations with American soldiers, airmen, and technical personnel. Under any blockade scenario, China must neutralize potential threats to its operations. That means putting these Philippine bases under immediate threat through missile strikes or special operations. The United States now faces compounded crisis. Not just Taiwan, but also direct attacks on American military personnel in a third country. The political pressure for response becomes overwhelming. Domestic audiences demand protection of American troops. Allied nations watch to see if the United States will defend its forward positions. The decision space for de-escalation narrows dramatically. This is exactly what strategists call a tripwire force. Small enough that it cannot independently affect the military balance. Large enough that its engagement guarantees full commitment of the larger power. The United States has effectively created 9 tripwires that ensure American involvement in any regional conflict, regardless of whether that involvement serves American interests. Now let me show you why this is a trap rather than deterrence. Deterrence works when the threat of retaliation is credible and the cost of aggression exceeds the benefit. But examine what America is actually threatening here. If China attacks these bases, what is the American response? Strike Chinese territory? That escalates to full-scale war between nuclear powers. Do nothing? That destroys American credibility permanently. China, meanwhile, operates from a completely different strategic position. Every base is within range of weapon systems that China has spent 20 years perfecting. The conventional military balance in the region favors China in terms of proximity, force concentration, and logistical sustainability. Most critically, China is fighting for what it considers core territorial interests, while America is fighting to maintain alliance credibility 7,000 miles from home. Game theory asks one fundamental question: what does each player actually want? China wants to control its near seas and resolve the Taiwan question. America wants to maintain regional hegemony and alliance structure. The Philippines bases give America symbolic presence, but not actual military advantage. They give China clear justification for military buildup and concrete targets in any conflict scenario. This brings us to the most important question. Why would the United States make this commitment? Why create these vulnerabilities? The answer reveals something profound about how empires think in their decline phase. The historical pattern island fortresses and imperial overreach. History does not repeat, but it follows patterns so consistent that ignoring them guarantees disaster. The pattern we are watching now is island fortress strategy during imperial competition. And every single example throughout history ends the same way. The British Empire in the 1930s constructed a massive naval base at Singapore. The Gibraltar of the East, they called it. 15-inch guns, underground ammunition magazines, facilities to support the entire British Pacific Fleet. The strategic logic was identical to what we are seeing now. Singapore would be the anchor point for maintaining British control over maritime approaches to India and the Pacific. An unsinkable aircraft carrier demonstrating British commitment to defending Asian interests. Singapore fell to Japan in February 1942 in what Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. Not because the British forces were incompetent, not because the base was poorly constructed, but because the entire concept of defending a fixed position thousands of miles from home while your adversary operates from adjacent territory is strategically incoherent. The Japanese simply bypassed the naval defenses by attacking through the Malay Peninsula. The massive guns faced the wrong direction. The forces that Britain committed to Singapore defense became prisoners rather than deterrents. And the fall of Singapore shattered the myth of British invincibility across Asia, accelerating the collapse of the entire imperial structure in the region. The United States already knows this lesson from personal experience. The Philippines was American territory when Japan attacked in December 1941. General Douglas MacArthur commanded substantial forces, including the U.S. Army Philippine Division, Philippine Army units, and the Far East Air Force with over 200 aircraft. The strategic assumption was that these forces could hold until relief arrived from Hawaii. Japan destroyed the Air Force on the ground 9 hours after Pearl Harbor. Japanese forces landed in multiple locations across Luzon. American and Filipino forces retreated to Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor Island. They held for 5 months before surrendering in April and May 1942. Over 75,000 troops became prisoners of war in the largest surrender in American military history. The United States spent the next 3 years conducting an island-hopping campaign to return to the Philippines, suffering massive casualties to retake territory that could not be defended initially. The lesson should have been definitive. Island bases cannot be defended against adversaries with local superiority and determination to control adjacent seas. But let me give you the example that is most precisely parallel to the current situation. The French in Indochina during the 1950s established fortified positions throughout Vietnam to control territory and demonstrate commitment to remaining in Southeast Asia. The most infamous was Dien Bien Phu, a valley fortress in northwestern Vietnam near the Laotian border. The French strategic logic was sophisticated. By placing a fortress in remote territory, they would draw Viet Minh forces into open battle where French firepower superiority would destroy them. The base could be resupplied by air. The surrounding hills would be held by French forces. The Vietnamese would break themselves against modern defenses. Dien Bien Phu fell in May 1954 after a 56-day siege. The Viet Minh surrounded the base with artillery, cutting off air resupply. French forces on the surrounding hills were overrun. The fortress that was supposed to demonstrate French military superiority became a symbol of colonial futility. France withdrew from Indochina. The entire imperial project in Southeast Asia ended. What connects these examples? Fixed positions, extended supply lines, adversaries with local advantages, and metropolitan powers believing that technological superiority and military professionalism can overcome geographic and strategic fundamentals. The pattern is so consistent that ignoring it requires willful blindness. Now, apply this pattern recognition to the current situation. The United States is establishing multiple fixed positions in the Philippines. These positions sit 200 to 1,000 miles from American naval and air bases capable of providing support. They face an adversary with massive conventional forces operating from adjacent territory with comprehensive missile networks specifically designed to neutralize these exact types of installations. The historical pattern suggests the outcome with near certainty. These bases will either be abandoned in crisis, revealing American commitments as hollow, or they will be attacked and destroyed, providing the same symbolic defeat that Singapore gave Britain or Dien Bien Phu gave France. Neither outcome advances American interests. Both outcomes accelerate American decline in the region. But there is a deeper pattern operating here that we need to examine. This is not just about military strategy. This is about empire in its late stage making decisions that accelerate its own collapse. The economics of unsustainable commitment. Let me take you inside the economic calculation because this is where the structural forces become undeniable. The United States currently maintains approximately 750 military installations in over 80 countries worldwide. This global presence costs approximately $200 billion annually in operation, maintenance, and personnel. That does not include procurement, research, or veteran benefits. Just the cost of maintaining the infrastructure and forces at these locations. The 9 Philippine bases add measurably to this burden. $300 million in initial infrastructure investment represents just the entry cost. Annual operating expenses for these facilities will exceed $50 million for fuel, maintenance, local contracting, and utilities. Personnel rotation costs add another $30 million annually. Equipment prepositioning, ammunition storage, and continued upgrades will require hundreds of millions more over the next decade. Meanwhile, the United States defense budget faces structural constraints that Pentagon planners openly acknowledge cannot be sustained. The Congressional Budget Office projects that mandatory spending on Social Security, Medicare, and interest on national debt will consume the entire federal revenue by 2040 without tax increases or benefit cuts. Defense spending as discretionary expenditure will face increasing pressure. China, operating from a completely different economic position, can maintain comprehensive regional military presence at fraction of American cost. Chinese bases operate on Chinese territory or in countries with which China shares land borders. No transoceanic supply lines. No need for massive naval logistics. No rotation of personnel across 12 time zones. The cost asymmetry is staggering. Here is the calculation that matters. For every dollar the United States spends projecting power to the Western Pacific, China spends approximately 20 cents achieving equivalent capability in its own region. This is not because Chinese technology is superior. This is because geography and logistics create fundamental cost advantages that no amount of military spending can overcome. The United States is fighting the economic battle that Britain fought against Germany in the early 20th century. Britain maintained global naval supremacy while Germany built continental power. The British spent enormous resources maintaining bases, coaling stations, and naval forces worldwide. Germany concentrated forces in Europe, where it actually intended to fight. When the crisis came, Britain could not bring enough power to the decisive theater because its resources were distributed globally. The American position is worse. Britain at least operated from industrial supremacy and could outproduce rivals. The United States faces an adversary with larger industrial base, greater shipbuilding capacity, and comprehensive manufacturing advantage. China launched more tonnage of naval vessels in 2022 than the entire British Royal Navy displaces. The industrial foundations of military power have shifted decisively. Adding commitments in the Philippines while these economic realities exist is not strategy. It is the behavior of an empire that cannot accept changed circumstances and continues making commitments it cannot sustain. This brings us to the predictions. What actually happens next? Where do these structural forces lead? Scenario development, 3 pathways forward. Let me outline the three most probable scenarios based on the structural analysis we have conducted. These are not predictions in the sense of certain knowledge. These are analytical projections based on game theory, historical patterns, and economic constraints. Scenario 1, managed retreat within 5 years. Probability 40%. The United States recognizes that the Philippine bases create more vulnerability than capability. A face-saving withdrawal occurs justified by Philippine domestic politics, regional diplomacy changes, or budget constraints. The bases are gradually reduced from military installations to symbolic cooperation facilities with minimal permanent presence. American focus shifts to more defensible positions in Guam, Japan, and Australia. This scenario preserves some American credibility by framing withdrawal as strategic choice rather than defeat. It reduces exposure to indefensible commitments, but it also signals to every regional ally that American security guarantees cannot be relied upon when serious costs emerge. Scenario 2, tripwire engagement leading to limited conflict. Probability 35%. Taiwan crisis or South China Sea confrontation escalates to limited strikes against Philippine bases housing American forces. The United States must respond to avoid catastrophic credibility collapse. Limited conventional exchange occurs primarily through missile and airstrikes. Neither side pursues full-scale war due to nuclear escalation risks. Fighting ends with tacit understanding that American forward basing in First Island chain is not sustainable. This scenario destroys substantial military assets on both sides. It likely includes loss of American lives, generating domestic political crisis. Most critically, it demonstrates in practice what analysis predicts in theory. American forces cannot be defended in these positions against determined Chinese action. The conflict accelerates American withdrawal from forward positions while damaging but not destroying the alliance structure. Scenario 3, Philippine political shift ending agreement. Probability 25%. Domestic Philippine politics shifts against the alliance as costs become apparent and benefits remain abstract. Whether through election, political movement, or elite calculation, the Philippines requests termination or substantial modification of base agreement. This could follow pattern of previous Philippine decisions to close American bases in 1991. This scenario allows the United States to avoid military defeat while still experiencing strategic setback. American presence ends not through Chinese military action, but through allied choice, which is arguably more damaging to the alliance system. It demonstrates that providing security guarantees is insufficient when host nations calculate that the costs of hosting outweigh benefits. All three scenarios lead to the same endpoint: substantial reduction or elimination of American military presence in Philippine territory within a decade. The only variables are the pathway taken and the degree of damage suffered along the way. The structural forces make this outcome nearly inevitable. Extended supply lines, indefensible positions, economic constraints, and local power advantages all point in the same direction. The question is not whether the commitment proves unsustainable. The question is how America manages the transition when it becomes undeniable. Synthesis and framework application. What we are witnessing in the Philippines is a microcosm of broader patterns that define American foreign policy in this era. The strategic logic appears sophisticated on surface level. Demonstrate commitment, deter aggression, support allies, maintain regional influence. But the underlying structural analysis reveals fatal flaws that historical pattern recognition should have prevented. The 9 Philippine bases create multiple simultaneous vulnerabilities. They commit forces to indefensible positions. They create tripwires that reduce decision-making flexibility in crisis. They impose economic costs that cannot be sustained given broader fiscal constraints. They provide adversaries with clear justification for military expansion and concrete targets in conflict scenarios. Most critically, they represent exactly the type of imperial overextension that has destroyed every previous hegemon throughout history. This is not prophecy. This is game theory and structural analysis. The incentive structures, geographic realities, economic constraints, and historical patterns all align to produce predictable outcomes. When empires make commitments they cannot sustain, in territories they cannot defend against adversaries with local advantages, those commitments become liabilities that accelerate decline. The tragedy is that this was avoidable. The United States could have maintained productive relationship with the Philippines without creating unsustainable military commitments. Economic cooperation, diplomatic engagement, and selective security assistance could have preserved influence without creating the vulnerabilities that comprehensive base access generates. But that would have required accepting reduced military presence and acknowledging that maintaining global hegemony is no longer strategically coherent. Empires in their decline phase cannot make that acknowledgement. They respond to erosion of power by making additional commitments intended to demonstrate strength. Each commitment creates new vulnerabilities that require additional resources to defend. The cycle continues until economic exhaustion or military defeat forces recognition of changed circumstances. I might be wrong about the specific timeline or pathway. The scenarios outlined represent probabilistic projections, not certain knowledge. What I am confident about is the structural analysis. Geography, economics, and historical patterns create forces that individual decisions cannot overcome. The Philippine bases represent strategic mistake regardless of tactical execution quality. We will continue watching these developments closely. As tensions in the region evolve, as economic constraints become more apparent, as domestic Philippine politics develops, the predictions made here will either be validated or refuted. That is how analytical frameworks are tested. Make explicit predictions, examine outcomes, refine understanding based on results. The most important thing is that you never accept any analysis, including this one, without examining the evidence yourself. Look at the military geography, study the historical examples, analyze the economic constraints, test the game theory logic. The framework provided here is not truth with capital T. It is systematic approach to understanding structural forces that shape events. What makes analysis valuable is not that it tells you what to think. What makes it valuable is that it provides framework for thinking about complex situations in ways that reveal patterns and predict outcomes. Use this framework, question it, test it against events as they unfold. Develop your own analytical capabilities rather than simply accepting anyone's conclusions. History is unfolding in real time. The decisions being made today in Manila and Washington will shape the Indo-Pacific region for generations. The outcome is not predetermined by individual choices, but by structural forces that those choices either recognize or ignore. The question is whether American leadership will acknowledge these forces before catastrophic failure makes acknowledgement unavoidable. That is the analysis for tonight. We will return to this framework as events develop. The structural forces are in motion. The only question is how long until their effects become undeniable.